Hey everyone, just a quick reminder that this is actually part 2 of the video, and if you haven't watched part 1, you can do it over here. Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I read The Sign of the Four and A Study in Scarlet, the first 2 entries in this series, and I found them quite interesting, though not as compelling as I thought I would. So I'm going to continue with the series because I would like to know what else is happening in it, and I know that some of the more popular works from it come later on. Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. Now, I have read and reread this series a gajillion times, and I'm currently in the process of reading it gajillion and 1 times. Now, I know that there are controversies with the author recently, and I know that people are upset with her. I don't follow up with current stuff, but either way, I'm not just gonna throw away my favorite series that has gotten me through a lot of tough times, being that my throwing it away will change absolutely nothing in the world. So I'm gonna continue rereading it. Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Oh my god, what do I do with this series? To begin with, I absolutely love the first 2 books from this series, which I have read. Lucy Maud Montgomery writes books that speak directly to my heart. She gets me as excited about life as I was when I was a kid. Do you remember that feeling that the world is endless and only good things are about to happen? So I loved Anne of Green Gables, I loved Anne of Avonlea, but I'm a little worried that the further into the series that we get, the more heavy and sad the books are gonna get. I don't know why I have that expectation. So I was kind of thinking to just stay with these 2 books and create my head canon around them, imagine that only good things happen to Anne afterwards. But I also would like to read more of her story, so I'm gonna read 1 more book from the series and see how I feel about that, and if I feel too sad, I'm gonna DNF it. And I know that that's a cowardly thing to do, but hey, it's me, it's my life, I do whatever I want. White Sand by Brandon Sanderson. This is a trilogy of graphic novels, and I read the first 2 and they were okay. I was interested in the story, but I didn't like the medium. I think the graphic novel didn't do them justice, maybe because the art style wasn't my favorite, or maybe because the sequence wasn't properly executed. I'm not an expert in this area, obviously, so I don't exactly know, but this is how I explain it in my head. I'm still gonna read the 3rd novel because it's one of the 2 Cosmere books that I haven't read yet. The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. This is an adult epic fantasy quartet and one of my favorite series so far. I have read the first 2 books and loved each one of them. This author just knows how to write books that make you want to high-five the universe, you know? This level of catharsis. So I'm going to continue with this series definitely, and I'm going to hope to finish it in 2024. I actually was even thinking of rereading the first 2 books, if you can believe it. The First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is an adult grimdark fantasy trilogy, and I read it a few years ago and I loved it. It's one of my favorite series of all times, and I highly recommend it. Jack Reacher by Lee Child. This is an adult thriller series. It's very difficult to say adult thriller for me. As you can see, it is quite hefty, and I think it's continued to be written by the author's brother. Actually, I love these books. I read 5 of them and they're such a great time. I highly recommend it for people who like military adjacent high action thrillers. Those might not be to everybody's taste depending on what you like, but they're undoubtedly well written and very, very fun to read. Enola Holmes by Nancy Springer. Am I lying to you? Yes, it is Nancy Springer. This is a series of young adult historical fiction novels where the main character is the niece of Sherlock Holmes, Enola, who is very, very smart and goes around and solves mysteries, and it's just a great time. I highly recommend it, mostly to girls and women, because the narrative centers women. And not that I don't think that's worthy of men's time as well, but I think it's going to be more interesting to women in general. Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. This is becoming one of my favorite young adult fantasy series, kind of against all odds because I started reading it with the pretty much expectation to absolutely hate it. And while in the beginning I kind of did, the more I read through it, the more I started liking it, and now I'm just eating up those books and enjoying them so very much. Say what you want about Sarah J. Maas, the woman knows how to write very addictive stories. So I am definitely going to continue with this one. Shadow Scent by, who was the author? PM Freestone. This is a young adult fantasy duology that is set in the desert and surrounds a perfume maker. I read the first book, The Darkest Bloom, 2 or 3 years ago. I found it as an ebook and I wanted to give it a try, and I had a good time. It's a well-written book, the story is interesting, the characters are nice, but to be honest with you, I got what I wanted from that first one book, and I have no interest to continue with the series, so I'm gonna DNF it, but I'm gonna recommend it. Vampire Academy by Richelle Mead. Oof, did I hate this book, because I only read the first book from the series. I started reading it once 2 or 3 years ago, and I DNF'd it kind of 40% into it. I usually give the books around 40% before I DNF, but I DNF'd it, and then I finished it this year in order to fulfill one of my special missions for my TBR game, and let me tell you, DNFing was the right choice. I was so exasperated with this main character and with the stupid narrative. It's, by the way, a series of young adult urban fantasy books, which obviously aren't targeting me because I'm in my mid-30s. Had I read it as a teenager, who knows, maybe I would have liked it more, but I didn't. So I'm DNFing this series and never touching a book from it with a stick. My apologies to everybody who loves this series. It is no stain on your character or on your taste that you like it. We're all different people. We all see things in a different way. We all get different things from books. You don't need my justification, but you have it anyway. Iron Widow. Alright, Xin and Jay Zhao is here on YouTube, and they are very charismatic and very fun to watch. I recommend you go check them out. However, I had fundamental issues with the first book from this series, which carries the name Iron Widow. I read it last year was it? Or the year before that? I can't exactly remember. I think it was last year. I read it for an Illumicrate reading challenge where I took it upon myself to read all the books that I had acquired up to this point from Illumicrate boxes. And this was the first book I ever got from Illumicrate, and I hated it so much. If you're interested in hearing my full opinion on it, you can go check out the video. I'm gonna link it here if I don't forget. But the book had so much potential. The action and the story could have been amazing. The character relationships could have been amazing. But the author executed them in a way that I don't want to say I hate it, but I hate it. And I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm not gonna continue with the series. Obviously, just keep in mind, if this is the first time you hear about this book, that a lot of people love it, so maybe it's just a me thing. Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This is a series that currently contains only one book, and it's adult fantasy. I have heard from the author that he has plans on continuing it, so whenever he does, I'm gonna continue too. The Cosmere. This is an amalgamation of a lot of different series within this Cosmere universe by Brandon Sanderson. Don't look at this number here. I have read all but 2 books from this series, one of which is the 3rd volume of White Sand, and the second of which is The Sunlit Man, which is the most recently released secret project by Brandon Sanderson. I love this world, I love this universe. I'm gonna continue reading the books from it. The Far Year Trilogy by Robin Hobb. This is an adult epic fantasy trilogy, and I read the first 2 books from it, and I loved the first one. Absolutely loved it. One of the best books I've ever read. And the second one I enjoyed, but I had some issues with 2 specific things in the story, one of which was one particular character motivation conflict, and the other thing was one of the characters that was really whiny and annoying. But I liked the book well enough, and I'm gonna read the 3rd one as soon as I can. Kirin Fie, I have no idea how to pronounce this, okay? By Jenny Colgan. This is a series of adult romance companion novels, and I read the first 2, The Bookshop on the Corner and The Bookshop on the Shore, and I liked them okay enough, but to be honest with you, I only read them because they were buddy reads and I was kind of required to. I wouldn't have otherwise, and therefore I'm not gonna continue with the series. Little Thieves by Margaret Owens, I think. This is a young adult fantasy duology that is told kind of like a fairy tale, and I read the first book, Little Thieves, as a part of my Illumicrate reading challenge, and it was okay. I wasn't excited. It's not a bad book, but I wasn't interested in the characters at all. I found the book slightly too shallow and a little too convenient at times, and I have absolutely no desire to continue with it, so DNF. The Last Binding by Freya Marska. Am I pronouncing this correctly? Who knows? This is an adult historical fantasy romance series. I read the first book as part of my Illumicrate reading challenge again, and I DNF'd it at like 40%. I was bored, nothing was happening, I didn't care about the story at all, so I'm gonna DNF the series as well. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This is a middle grade to young adult mythological fantasy series, and it's a great time, and I read it and I loved it, and I'm gonna continue continue with the following series, which was Heroes of Olympus, something like that. Not 100% sure. I recommend though. This Woven Kingdom by Tahera Mafi. This is actually a trilogy now. It was a duology back when I read the first book, which also carries the name This Woven Kingdom. This is a young adult fantasy series that is based on Middle Eastern mythology, and I really liked the first book, honestly. I loved the main female character. She was kind and smart and altogether worthy of respect. But to be honest with you, now that I think back to it, I just have no interest in continuing. I have no excitement for this world. I have no excitement to find out what's gonna happen with this series, so I'm not gonna lie to you and to myself. I'm not gonna continue with it. Elements of Cadence by Rebecca Ross. This is a young adult, I couldn't tell you, fantasy duology, and I read the first book, A River Enchanted, again as part of my Lumicrate reading challenge. And to this day, I couldn't tell you whose story this book was trying to tell. There were a lot of characters, but not one of them was interesting enough to follow. The story was flat and told in this dream-like kind of way, which made it very confusing. The narrative didn't make absolutely any sense to me. The magic system was so soft that you could never tell what's going on and why. And therefore, I am going to the NF. Banon Renard by Julie Garwood. This is a series of adult romantic suspense companion novels, and I have read 3 books from it so far. The first one, the second one, and the 6th one, and I liked all 3 of them very much. They featured a nice romantic couple and a nice mystery on the side. They're a good time, but I've only read them because I had the books and I was required to. Otherwise, I would have never reached for them. So I'm just gonna DNF the series. But I recommend it to people who are into romance and romantic suspense. Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is a young adult fantasy series, and I read the first book, Howl's Moving Castle, last year, I believe, and I loved it. It was so cozy and so nice, and I'm gonna continue with the series one day. Full Metal Alchemist by Hiromu Arakawa. This is my favorite manga series. I have talked about it at length multiple times. I haven't read that many manga series, but from what I've read, I've liked this one the most so far, and I'm definitely going to continue with it. Earthsea Cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is an adult epic fantasy classic series, and I read A Wizard of Earthsea last year, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. But I feel no excitement to continue with this story. To be fair with you, if I'm not forced to, I'm not going to continue with it, and since I'm not forced to, I'm not gonna continue with it. And I know that might irk some people, but it is what it is. If you read it and loved it, that's great. You still get to enjoy it. Nothing changes. Alex Stern by Leigh Bardugo. This is an adult urban fantasy dark academia trilogy, and I read the first 2 books and I liked them way more than I thought I would. I'm not a big dark academia fan, unlike the majority of the world, but I like this one and I recommend it if you haven't read it. Peter Pan by James Matthew Barry. I read Peter Pan when I was a kid, and then I read it 2 years ago again, and I liked it, but I have heard that the rest of the books from this series aren't great, particularly Peter Pan and the Kensington Gardens, or whatever the book is called, and so I'm not going to continue with it. I wasn't excited to do so either way. I am too old for these books, I think, as of right now. Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. I read the first book, Empire of the Vampire, last year. Was it last year? I think it was last year or the year before that. Doesn't matter. Loved it. One of the best vampire books, and I always add to that I haven't read that many, but I really enjoyed it. I had some issues with it, mostly pacing wise, but I'm still very curious to continue with the series, and the next book, Empire of the Damned, is coming in 2024, so I'm looking forward to it. The Cemetery of Forgotten Books by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is a series of adult historical fiction, mystery, thriller, horror novels, if I can qualify them in that way. I read the first book, The Shadow of the Wind, last year, and I really enjoyed it, though it was way darker and way grittier than I initially anticipated, so keep that in mind if you read it, but I do recommend it, and I'm gonna continue with the series. Discworld by Terry Pratchett, one of the most popular fantasy/science fiction adult series, and it has a ton of books. Most of them are very short, and I read one of them, Mort, last year, and it was really fun, and I was planning to continue with some other Terry Pratchett books this year, but I didn't. I will though, one day. A Targaryen History by George R. Martin and a few other people. I read Fire and Blood last year again, and it was a good time. This is an adult fantasy/made-up history duology, and if you like that kind of boring books that feature a bajillion names and can put you to sleep at the drop of a hat, this is definitely for you. This is exactly what I like, by the way, and I had a great time with it, so I'm gonna continue with it. Book of the Eyes by Mark Lawrence. This is the second series of the author that is set in the world of the Book of the Ancestor, and I read The Girl in the Stars last year, or was it this year? I don't remember anymore. I had a good time. It wasn't perfect. There were some issues with it, but I enjoyed it, and I'm gonna continue with the series. The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. I'm gonna continue with the series because I loved book 1. Whether the author is gonna continue with the series, we don't know, but we'll see one day. The Green Bones Saga by Fonda Lee. This is an adult mafia fantasy, and I read the first book, Jade City. Again, was it last year or this year? Time is an endless circle, honestly. But I liked the book. It was nice. The story was well written. Everything was fine with it, except I'm not a big fan of fantasy mafia. It's definitely not my thing. I couldn't care less. It didn't grab me. And I know that a lot of people love it, but I don't care, you know? It was good. Nothing wrong with it, I just don't care. I'm gonna DNF, don't be mad. A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. I have read and reread these books ad nauseum, and I'm gonna continue doing so. Nothing to add here, you know the series. If you've lived on this planet for more than a year, you know what it is. Enchanted by, who was it? Gail Carson Levine. I read Enchanted in January of 2023, and it was okay. I'm too old for these books. I'm not gonna continue with the series. Those are middle grade to young adult fantasy books with a lot of adventure and a lot of magical creatures, and I just don't care. Remembrance of Earth's Past. What was this? Oh, okay, so this is an adult science fiction trilogy by Sachin Liu. The first book, The Three-Body Problem, I read in January of this year, and I really loved. I didn't expect to like it that much, but I did. There was historical elements, there were science elements, there were futuristic elements, alien elements. It was great. I loved it. I'm gonna continue with the series. It's a little dense though, so if you start reading it, keep that in mind. The Expanse by James S.A. Corey. This is an adult science fiction series, and I read the first 3 books from it and loved every single one of them. The authors managed to surprise me every single time, and I can't wait to continue with the series. I highly recommend it, although you've probably already heard about this series ad nauseum. There is a TV show as well, which is also highly acclaimed, so there. The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. This is an adult graphic novel series that tells the story of Sandman, which has been a recently very popular DC character. I didn't know he was a DC character. That's irrelevant. People are probably going to judge me about this, but I'm gonna DNF it. I read Preludes and Nocturnes, which is the first volume from the series 2 years ago, and while I liked it quite a bit, it's a little too gruesome for me. I'm not a fan of that kind of brutality in graphic novels, and I also didn't like the art style, so I have no interest in continuing with this. DNF. Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. I read 2001: A Space Odyssey by the author 2 years ago, and it made my favorite books of the year, and I still think about it to this day, so I'm definitely going to continue with the series. The River City Duology by Rose Sabo, I believe is the name of the author. I read the first book, We All Fall Down, last year, again as part of my Illumicrate reading challenge, and the book has one of the most beautiful covers I have ever seen. Unfortunately, the contents of this book aren't great. The author had tried to do something spectacular in my opinion, but they have fallen short of actually executing it well. The book was confusing and boring, to be honest with you. So I'm not gonna continue with the series, and when I looked on the internet, I don't see the second book coming out anytime soon, if ever, so there you go. Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson. I will never not be salty about this series, because as you can see here, there's only one book in it. And why is that? Let me tell you a story. Last year in September or October, I picked up Vespertine, which at the time was book number 1 from the Vespertine series, and I read it and I loved it. It was so interesting, so gripping. The world was fantastic, and the main character was one of the most likable main characters I have ever read in a book. And then recently I went to check when is the second book coming out, and now Vespertine is a standalone apparently, and I simply can't get over it. I am actually considering writing a letter to the author, like real letter on paper with a pen. Something must be done. I need to get another book from this series, guys. Anyways, The Andromeda Train by Michael Crichton. I read the first book from the series, The Andromeda Train, 2 years ago, and I liked it. It was okay, but I didn't like it enough to continue with the series. I got from it what I got from it, and that's that. I'm not interested to continue. DNF. The Lycanius Trilogy by James Islington. Still don't know how to pronounce that name. I read The Shadow of What Was Lost last year and I really liked it. Though to be honest with you, the book was kind of dense. A lot of things were happening. This is an adult epic fantasy trilogy with some of the most beautiful covers out there. And I will continue with the series. I would love to continue with the series, but I suspect that I might have to reread the first book in order to do that because I have forgotten so much. I had forgotten a lot by the end of the book right after I read it. Avatar: The Last Airbender comics. This is obviously a series of young adult graphic novels that follow the events of the animated TV show, which I absolutely loved, and I'm reading through these graphic novels now, and I like them as well. I like the writing style, I like the stories. I'm gonna continue with it. Black Tongue by Christopher Buehlman. I read The Black Tongue Thief last year and I have 2 reviews of the book. It made a big impression on me. I love the writing style, I love the characters, I love the world. And recently, book number 0, basically the prequel to the first book, was announced to be released in 2024 and I'm really excited about it, so I'm going to continue with the series. The Ria Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. This is an adult epic fantasy trilogy and I read it last year, loved it. One of my favorite series of all times. Great fun time. I highly recommend it. It was very surprising at times, very satisfying. It had one of the most satisfying endings I have ever read in a fantasy series, in my opinion. And so I really need to continue reading Michael J. Sullivan's writing, but I haven't yet. Recommend the series, obviously.